Hello everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we follow James and Diep as they finally settle into their newly built home, filled with pride and hope for the future. But while preparing a simple grilled chicken dinner, an accident sparks a fire that nearly destroys everything. In the heat of panic, James lashes out at Diep with harsh words, leaving her heart heavy with hurt. What unfolds next is not just about putting out flames, but about mending the fragile bond between them. Stay with us until the end to see how James faces his mistake, and don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The sun dipped low, casting an amber glow over the yard as smoke curled lazily from the makeshift grill James had built. He wiped his brow. The smell of charcoal thick in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of damp soil. Diep hummed softly as she plucked herbs. Her sleeves rolled high, cheeks warm from the fire. Nee perched nearby on a little stool, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, crayons scattered across the ground. Diep leaned over the chicken, brushing on marinade with practiced strokes. The fire crackled, sparks snapping to life. She bent a little closer, fanning it lightly, not noticing how the flames licked higher, chasing along a dry piece of wood stacked nearby. Within moments, smoke thickened, curling upwards into the roof beams. "Diep!" James's voice cut sharp, panic threading his tone. He dropped the tongs, grabbed a bucket, and splashed water against the rising flame. Diep gasped, heart pounding, as orange tongues of fire began creeping toward the wooden wall of their newly finished house. Together they scrambled, James dousing the edges, while Diep beat at the smaller flames with a wet cloth. Nye stood frozen, eyes wide, tears pooling as the smoke swirled into her drawings. At last, after what felt like forever, the fire hissed and died, leaving behind only blackened streaks and the sharp sting of burnt wood. James's chest heaved, his shirt damp from sweat and spray, while Diep coughed, her face flushed from heat and fear. But instead of relief, James's face hardened. "Diep!" he snapped, pointing at the scorched beam. "Do you realize what you've done? The house, our house, could have burned down. Why weren't you paying attention?" His words struck like stones, heavy and cutting. Diep's lips parted, trembling. She clutched the damp cloth, her knuckles white. I didn't mean to. I thought I had it under control." Her voice wavered, shame flooding her eyes. "You thought." James's tone sharpened. "Being careless like that, after everything we've built, after all the work, one moment, and it could all be gone." Nee sniffled softly, her small hands clutching her sketchbook to her chest. The silence after James's outburst was thick, filled with the faint hiss of cooling embers. Diep lowered her gaze, shoulders slumping. The joy she'd carried in preparing the meal vanished, replaced by a dull ache in her chest. She turned away, blinking back tears, busying herself with gathering the scattered herbs, though her hands trembled. James rubbed his temples, pacing a short distance before collapsing onto the step. The anger in him simmered, but beneath it lay exhaustion, the frustration of weeks spent building, scraping, and fixing, only to see it nearly ruined in a single careless moment. Still, the harshness of his words lingered, and he felt the sting of his own temper. Nee approached Diep cautiously, tugging at her sleeve. "It's okay, Miss Diep," she whispered. "We stopped the fire. The house is still here." Her innocent reassurance cut deeper than James's scolding. Diep forced a small smile for Nee's sake, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face. "Thank you, dear," she murmured, though her heart felt heavy. The grilled chicken lay forgotten, half charred, its aroma now tainted by smoke. James stared at it blankly before sighing. He lifted the tray and set it aside. "We'll eat later," he muttered. His voice carried less bite now, but the damage was done. The night pressed in quietly. A faint breeze carried away the smoke, leaving the yard cool and still. James sat with his elbows on his knees, watching the faint glow of embers. Diep moved about quietly, tidying the mess without a word. Nye tried drawing again, but her crayon hesitated at every stroke, the earlier tension weighing heavily. At last, James stood, walked over, and stopped just behind Diep. She didn't look up, her hands busy rinsing the charred brush in a basin. He inhaled slowly, regret pressing at his chest. "Diep." His voice was softer this time, almost weary. She stilled, but didn't turn, her silence speaking louder than words. James rubbed the back of his neck. "I shouldn't have shouted like that. I know it wasn't on purpose. It's just seeing the fire, after everything we've worked for. I panicked. This house, it's all we have. I shouldn't have blamed you like that." Diep's shoulders shook slightly, but she finally faced him, her eyes red. "You hurt me, James. I was scared too. But instead of standing with me, you made me feel like I destroyed everything." His heart clenched at her words. He stepped closer, his voice low. "I'm sorry. Truly. I let my frustration speak louder than my heart. The house can be repaired, but I can't risk breaking us apart over one mistake." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant chirp of crickets. Then Diep exhaled shakily, nodding just enough to show she'd heard him. Nye, sensing the air lighten, piped up softly. "Can we still eat the chicken, even if it's a little burnt?" James chuckled weakly, the tension easing from his face. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll eat it together." He glanced at Diep, offering a tentative smile. "Together." Slowly, Diep returned the smile, fragile but real. She sat beside him as he carefully carved the chicken, the charred edges trimmed away. The first bite wasn't perfect, but it carried warmth, the kind born of shared struggle, forgiveness, and the fragile promise of a new beginning. As they ate under the pale glow of the moon, the house stood behind them, scorched but intact, much like their bond. And in that quiet night, James realized that home wasn't just walls and beams. It was the people beside him, holding on even when the fire threatened to take it all away. The embers died down, leaving only ashes, but within James and Diep, a new resolve sparked quietly. Whatever came next, they would face it not with blame, but with understanding. The night deepened, and the stars stretched wide above the quiet yard. James leaned back against the wooden step, the remnants of their simple meal resting on a plate between him and Diep. Nee, satisfied with her small portion, had curled up nearby with her sketchbook, eyelids heavy as she tried to finish one last drawing before drifting into sleep. James glanced at her, then at Diep, who sat silently, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her cup. Guilt tugged at him again, sharper this time. He couldn't shake the image of her turning away earlier, shoulders stiff, eyes clouded with hurt. Diep, he began softly, his voice carrying more weight than volume. I need you to hear me, really hear me. Her hand stilled, but she didn't look up. I let the fire scare me, James continued, his words slow, measured. Not just because of the house. It's more than that. This place, it feels like proof that we're moving forward, that all our sacrifices weren't for nothing. When I saw the flames, I panicked. I saw everything slipping away. But I took that fear out on you. That wasn't fair. Diep's lashes lowered, her breath caught in her throat. She finally lifted her eyes to him, her expression a mix of weariness and sorrow. James, I understand fear. I was scared too. But when you yelled at me, it felt like I wasn't part of the dream we've been building. Like I was just a problem in the way. Her words struck deep, and James's chest tightened. He reached out, gently covering her hand with his. You're not in the way, Diep. You're the reason I even have this dream. Without you, I'd still be chasing money, still living a life that felt empty no matter how much I earned. This house, this life with you and Nye, it means more than anything I've ever built as a CEO. I don't want to lose that, and I don't want to lose you. The tremor in his voice was real, raw. Diep searched his face, finding no defensiveness there, only remorse and love that had been momentarily buried under frustration. Her heart softened, though the ache remained. I need you to promise me something, she whispered. Anything, James replied immediately. Promise that next time, no matter how hard things get, you'll stand with me, not against me. We can face mistakes, struggles, even fires, but not if we're divided. James squeezed her hand, his tone steady. I promise. I'll stand with you. Always. Diep's lips curved into a small, tired smile, but it was genuine. Relief washed through her chest, lightening the heaviness she'd carried since the fire. Nye stirred then, mumbling softly in her sleep, her sketchbook slipping from her fingers. James chuckled quietly, lifting it from her lap. The pages were filled with uneven shapes and smudged colors, flowers, chickens, and even a lopsided house with smoke curling from its roof. The sight made him laugh and wince at the same time. Looks like she captured tonight perfectly, James said, holding the page toward Diep. Diep leaned closer, a soft laugh escaping her lips. She's not wrong, though in her version, the fire looks almost cheerful. They shared a quiet moment of laughter, the kind that eases wounds and smooths the rough edges of a long day. Later, when Nye was settled onto a mat inside the half-finished house, James stepped back outside, the night cool against his skin. He found Diep standing near the charred beam, her fingers grazing the blackened wood. Her expression was thoughtful, not sad. This scar will stay, she murmured, glancing at him. James nodded, stepping beside her. Yes, but maybe it should. A reminder of how close we came to losing it, and how much it matters that we didn't. Diep turned to him fully, her voice soft but firm. A house is just wood and walls, James. What matters is us. I don't care if it takes years to make it perfect, as long as we're together in it. Her words landed deep in his heart, He slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her against him. Then, together, it is. The next morning, the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. James rose early, determined to fix what had been damaged. He fetched tools, inspected the beam, and planned how to replace what had been burned. But this time, he didn't work alone. Diep joined him, holding nails, steadying the wood, her presence a quiet anchor. Their hands brushed often, not by accident, and each time James felt gratitude swell within him. The air was filled with the rhythm of their work. The creak of wood, the clang of hammer against nail. A symphony of rebuilding not just a house, but trust. Nye bounced around them, humming cheerfully as if the previous night's fear had already faded. She sketched in the dirt with a stick, proudly declaring, "This time, I'll draw the house with no fire." Her innocent joy lightened the weight in both James and Diep's hearts. As the morning wore on, James paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the repaired wall, then at Diep, who was brushing dust from her hands. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "maybe last night was a lesson." Diep raised an eyebrow. "A lesson?" He nodded. "That even when the fire comes, even when things look like they'll burn down, we can put it out together. Maybe that's what this house will always remind me of." Diep smiled, her eyes warm. "Then it's a good reminder." By midday, the beam stood solid again, stronger than before. James ran a hand over it, satisfied. "Not perfect," he said, "but sturdy, just like us." Diep laughed lightly, shaking her head, always the philosopher. But when she looked at him, her heart swelled with something steady and sure. She knew the truth in his words, flawed, scarred, but unshakable. That evening, as the sun dipped low once more, the three of them sat outside, sharing another simple meal. This time, James tended the fire with calm care, and Diep teased him gently whenever he hovered too closely to the chicken. Laughter replaced tension. Warmth replaced blame. The scars of the night before remained, etched into the wood and into their memory. But instead of division, they now stood as proof of resilience. For James and Diep, the house was no longer just a symbol of progress. It was a testament to their bond. A place where mistakes could be forgiven, where tempers might flare, but love would always steady the flame. As Nye leaned sleepily against Diep's arm, James gazed at them both, his chest full. "This is home," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. And for the first time since the fire, peace settled over him. Not fragile, but firm, like the foundation of the house they had built. Not perfect, but unbreakable.